afternoon and welcome to Necessities of Life, the fifth episode of the Future of Agri-Food event series where we invite thought leaders to explore Canada's role in the agri-food sector. My name is Jessica Kelly. I'm a lecturer at the Ivey Business School and co-owner of a pig farm in southwestern Ontario. I'm pleased to be moderating today's live stream, hosted by Ivey Impact and the Centre for Building Sustainable Value on one of the most pressing issues in our community, food insecurity. Whether you've read about it in the news, seen it on social media, or experienced it firsthand, one thing is clear: food insecurity across Canada is on the rise. Soaring living costs have reduced the amount of household income available to spend on healthy food, forcing a growing number of working Canadians to turn to food banks just to get by. There is clearly a need to evaluate our current system and tackle the many factors that threaten food security. To unpack this issue, I'm joined by three policy experts from across Southern Ontario who, over the course of the next hour, will discuss what's working and what needs to change within municipal food systems. Together, we'll address the role of policy in ensuring access to safe, affordable, and healthy food. Time permitting, we'll also try to address a few questions from the audience towards the end. Before we dive in, I'll turn it over to our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with Gregory Ridge and then move over to Meaghan Richardson, followed by Evan Fraser.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Gregory Ridge. I'm a city councillor for Kingstown District in Kingston, Ontario. I did my master's of public policy at Queen's, and I am a big supporter of food advocacy and food policy because when I was a child, I grew up in a food insecure household. And so I'm happy to be here and discuss this today. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gregory. Meaghan.
Hi, everyone. Meaghan Richardson. I am the current Director of Development here at Food for Life. So Food for Life is Hamilton and Halton's largest food rescue charity. We rescue close to 5 million pounds of food each year, and we redistribute that out to over 90 food programs, half of which we run, and that equates to feeding about 4,500 households each and every week. So I came to this work from the agriculture sector, actually. I farm in Halton with my husband, and my first task was to bring the agricultural community together with the charitable community to work on food purchasing arrangements. So we would keep local food donor dollars in the local economy. And it's kind of blossomed into this career that I love very much. And I'm so excited to talk with you today about.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Meaghan. Evan.
Folks, it's absolutely a delight and a privilege to be here. My name is Evan Fraser, and I work on food systems. I work on trying to improve the productivity of food systems, but also the equity and the nutrition of food systems. And I do that from the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph. I also do a lot of work with the United Nations and federal government on various complicated but not very complicated acting committees, complicated sounding but not complicated acting committees, big mouthful committees, but at the federal and UN levels. Thanks very much, Jessica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today. Let's dive right in. So Meaghan, even in your introduction there, you mentioned a term food rescue. So in this food policy discussion, we hear terms like food rescue, food sovereignty, food security versus food insecurity, and not necessarily all of us understand what those terms mean and how they differ from one another. Could you help us to understand from your perspective what some of those terms mean and also why it's so important that we have a sort of foundational common understanding of those terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So those terms often do get intermixed, but they're actually quite the opposite of each other. So if you're in terms of food security, that's really a condition where everybody at all times has access to the food they need in the quantity, quality, variety of food, in terms of having their dietary and cultural needs met. It's really the overall best case scenario for a community and a country that everyone has what they need at all times. So that's really the ideal. And food security can start from the individual level. It goes through household to community to country. And that's why it intermixes all of these comments, like on terms like food sovereignty, food policy, agricultural policy, food waste. They all play a role in food security overall. Food insecurity is actually pretty much any state that is not that. So it's that kind of lack in any one of those areas that's often very much caused by income income and systemic inequality. And that often happens at the individual or household level, the community level. And what it does is it forces people into a state of uncertainty. So if people are unsure about where they're going to get food from, they could be everything from just worried about it. I might not have enough money today to buy food, or they could be experiencing physical and mental health, negative health impacts of prolonged material deficiency in those areas in terms of food. So food insecurity is a huge problem in our country. And there is a measure that a lot of charities will use that we use here. It's called the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. It helps us to rate someone's food insecurity experience from severe, that's they're skipping meals, they're going without, they're maybe prioritizing feeding their children over themselves, right through to marginal, which would be they're worried about it, they're feeling those stresses. And then what the scale calls secure, we talk about as being dependent. Someone is still in the food charitable sector, they're not truly food secure, because you're only food secure when you do not need to rely on others to help you access the food that you need, and the systems are in place to allow you to do that yourself. So that's kind of how I at least look at food security, food insecurity. I'm looking forward to hearing what Evan and Gregory think as well about that. And one of the mechanisms that we use here at Food for Life to kind of tackle some food insecurity from a symptomatic level is food rescue. So food rescue is really the activity of going out and trying to get food that is surplus, it's best before, it's damaged packaging. Sometimes it's better than grocery store food because it's never even reached the grocery store shelves. There's just too much of it in the system. And some of it is the stuff that you see that's on the 50% rack at the grocery store that we get and then we're able to give to people. So it's really a social and an environmental action that is often used interchangeably with food raising, food donations, that sort of thing. It's really how a sector starts to access food that we need. So I think really the most important distinction in my mind really is we've got food security and we've got food insecurity. They have very different policy solutions. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today, because food isn't the main driver of food insecurity, it's income. And I think coming up here, Evan and Gregory are going to talk a little bit about affordability. So hope that answers your question, Jessica.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Meaghan. That was hugely informative and a great segue into our next question. So you talked about, Meaghan, how this idea of food insecurity, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, in isolation. There are clearly a lot of other affordability issues that can sort of compound onto a household that results in some of these circumstances that you described. So Gregory, can you tell us a little bit more about, in your region, what are some of the affordability issues that policymakers have to be mindful of when they're trying to tackle this big challenge of food insecurity?
So thank you very much, and thank you, Meaghan. That was a wonderful answer. I could not agree with Meaghan more about the root causes of this issue that we're discussing today, and its income. But when we talk about affordability in general, or issues that are affecting this region of Kingston, it's the cost of housing, really, what it comes down to, right? When we're talking about affordability, we're talking about the average person or any person paying for the necessities, and that's shelter and food. And with a lack of housing development, well, I shouldn't say a lack of affordable housing development. We've done quite a bit of work on that, but I'll go into that later. We haven't caught up with where we need to be. There was a considerable lack of investment in public housing, social housing, ever since the 95 federal budget, and that responsibility was downloaded onto the province. And so we as a society and here in Kingston are seeing that now. And that is one of the primary drivers for food insecurity in this region. And on top of the inflationary pressures for food in our food ecosystem that we're seeing. So some of the ways that we look at this as as municipality, as a council, and for policy development, we try to tackle affordability in a number of different ways. We have a municipal fee assistance program. So constituents or citizens, they can apply and they can get savings on things like transit, recreation, culture. We're doing different food pilots, garbage bag tags, these things that, you know, sound potentially benign, but are operated by the municipality and thus are within our purview to help people in their costs. We talked about affordable housing briefly. You know, that's something that we've been working on as a council. We take that very seriously. By the end of this year, we'll have had 272 affordable housing units, either privately or publicly developed within our term. So that's since the end of 2022. That's still something that we need to be working more on, and we're looking at different options. There's tiny homes, for example. We're doing a head lease program that's been very successful. And we're looking at reinvesting in co-ops, which is something that hasn't been as popular for policy in the past. And also looking at social infrastructure. So talking about community development, targeted microfunding for gardens, for local community food programs as well is something that we've been investing in. And focusing on making sure that when we have these policy discussions or when we meet with people, that it's as representative as possible. Often what has happened in the past when you're talking about just even basic conversations to help move policy along is that most of those people may not be experiencing food insecurity. They may not have income issues. And so ensuring that it's diverse and that we are looking at IDEA, for example, is really, really important. As a city council, we've also advocated for guaranteed basic income several times, I believe, which I think is something that can go a long way towards alleviating a lot of these issues.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Gregory. You certainly have a lot of different initiatives going on in your region, which is amazing to hear about. Evan, I'd like to hear from you a little bit about some of the underlying facets of inequality that you think policymakers need to consider when trying to address this complex issue in a really holistic way.
Such a good question. And let me just echo that I, too, completely agree with Meaghan's distinction and definition of food security versus food insecurity. So thanks for setting this up, Meaghan. And Gregory, thank you for bringing the housing crisis into the conversation, because I think that in many ways is my answer to your question, Jessica. If you look back at the data on what families spend their budgets on, and you go back, say, 2 or 3 generations, in the past, people spent a lot more of their budget on food. Food was more expensive. Even though we've come through a period of time of food price inflation, 2 generations ago, the average family spent more of their household budget on food than they do today. Today, the average Canadian spends about 10% of their budget on food. But to Gregory's point, we spend way more on housing and other things than we ever did before. And so even though food is a relatively small proportion of our overall budget, because you can skip meals or you can buy cheaper food, you can actually, a family that can't change their rent or their mortgage payments or their car payments or whatnot, can eat, poorer quality and smaller servings of food, which is why we have this weird situation of, quote, cheap food and rising food insecurity, which is on one level perverse, but when you see it in the context of extremely expensive housing, then it starts making sense. The other part of the answer to your question that I'd like to bring in our country, a huge amount of the social welfare net that we have, benefit packages that we offer, are administered through the tax code. And people have to file taxes and apply for disability tax credits and things like that. Of course, that not everybody files their taxes, and not everybody knows how to navigate the tax system. And those who are food insecure, and it disproportionately falls on racialized people, Indigenous communities, and new Canadians in particular, are not as adept as a person who has an education and has been living in Canada and speaks English or French as a first language. So there's huge systemic barriers to accessing the benefits which our government offers to people in the form of the tax code. So there's sort of 2 major policy initiatives that have nothing to do with food, to Meaghan's point, but actually drive food insecurity. Our housing policy and our tax policy become systemic barriers to achieving reducing food insecurity and achieving food security.
That's fascinating. I mean, the tax code piece is not something I had considered before, but absolutely that makes sense that the challenge of navigating that complex system is unfortunately disproportionately falling on the populations that are likely to be most impacted by this.
Exactly, Jessica, exactly.
Yeah, we know from research that, historically we thought of food banks as sort of this place of last resort that people would go when they had exhausted all other options and found themselves in sort of really unfortunate circumstances. But we're starting to learn that there's been some shifts in that sort of paradigm that we've understood about how food banks are used. Meaghan, could you tell us from your experience in your work what you know about sort of the shifts that have happened in food bank usage and who's relying on them and the frequency in which they're relying on that service?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking back to 10 years ago where we talked a lot about stigma and how to get people in the door, how to make sure we reached in and made sure people knew where we were and what they could get from us. And it was about trying to make sure that people knew we were there and make programming so that it would be inclusive as it should be, of course, and make sure it was welcoming. And now I think it's really turned to, and through COVID, it's become a little bit of a normalized thing in our society that when you need food, the food bank system, the food program system will be there for you and you can access it. And I think this is actually a very good thing that came out of COVID because people are not now waiting so long before they reach out for food support that they're going down this poverty spiral. And we see that a lot of times. If you can support people when they first start to struggle, when things first start to happen, if they have a job loss, a medical challenge, and you can get that support to them, they get back on their feet and they're kind of out of the system and doing their own thing again. And so I think this is a good thing that food programs are becoming more inclusive, more available, more utilized, but it also is causing a big challenge, I think, for the sector, the charitable sector, to maintain and support everyone that's coming. We're seeing a real shift in the number of people coming from all walks of life. So at Food for Life, we're serving about 30% of who we're serving are on Ontario Disability Support Program. About 30% are working, either part-time or full-time. 20% are seniors. So you're looking at very different demographics of need, different timeframes of need, and depths of need within those groups. We're, of course, sadly also seeing the number of people who come to us who are unhoused, who are struggling with housing. And that cohort of people also need a little bit of a different food program because if you're living on the street, it's very hard to cook broccoli, to chop cauliflower, those sorts of things. So you're trying to kind of tweak and make sure that programming is supporting everyone who needs it in different ways. We're also seeing that our sector has kind of become a food landing ground for refugees who are finding themselves in this country. They're often coming to the country, and the charitable food sector is really the food support program for those individuals as they're going through one of the hardest times in their lives. And so for us here at Food for Life, making sure that we're looking at cultural food support, food equity, that's becoming a really important thing for us as we support a growing, diverse community of varying needs. So that's been really, I think, those things are good changes. I think they're great. We're getting out of that, you come and you just get some pasta and canned food type food banking and food program system. But ultimately, we're seeing an increase across the board in every community, mostly over 20 to 30%. And at our location, we used to support 3,200 households maybe 3 years ago. Now we're up to 4,500 households each and every week. And that is not slowing down. We are starting to see the need widen, of course, but deepen. So we're seeing people who used to be able to come to just one program every week. Now they're starting to go to several programs. So maybe they're coming to Food for Life to get the healthy, fresh food, the perishable food. They're also going to the local food bank to get some of those staple items. They're also going to the local social support agency. So it's creating a lot of time poverty for people as well. It's really becoming a challenge for people to access what they need when those needs are deepening and moving from where we used to be a supplemental support, I think, as a sector. Now we're being relied upon for a significant part of people's grocery budgets. And I think that's to Evan's point, where people are able to make some small changes with their limited incomes, and then they're able to they're trying and looking for other avenues to kind of bolster their food. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Meaghan. Evan, I was wondering if you had anything that you'd wanted to add just from your perspective in terms of the role of food banks, how it may have changed over time, and even looking at things like the types of services provided by those types of organizations.
Yeah, thanks for queuing me up for that. And there's of the many rich things that Meaghan said, there's one trend that she mentioned that deeply worries me, and one trend which I'm excited and I guess pleased, if that's the right word to use in this context about. And the food banks in Canada started in the 1980s and were designed as a short-term measure to address an immediate acute need. And yet, a generation later, we are institutionally, structurally dependent on food banks. And in COVID, the federal government put a lot of money into COVID relief, but they also put a lot of money into food banks, which was necessary in that moment, but I think helped reinforce the fact that we are structurally dependent on emergency food aid for a very large percentage, arguably as much as 15% of the Canadian population. And so that's a very worrying trend. And that's not throwing any shade or discouragement on the work that Meaghan and the food bank emergency food relief programs are offering. It's a statement that our society doesn't have the tools to address the systemic issues. The positive thing, though, is that food banks and community food centers and broadly defined community food groups are stepping up to try to create what we sometimes call wraparound services. So a person can come and receive the hamper of food and the fresh produce, hopefully, but also receive training in, say, food literacy and support groups to how to access taxes and a range of other social development, community-oriented services. And then reimagining the food bank is simply a place where, quote, and I'm using my language very deliberately, a poor person goes to get a handout. Reimagining that to a place that empowers people and addresses the systemic root causes of some of these structural issues is entirely positive. So I really like the way, in as much as we're in a moment where 15% of Canadians are food insecure. In that moment, I really like the way that food banks are attempting to redefine themselves as far more than just a place to hand out emergency food and try to address as much as possible those root causes. So well done, Meaghan. Thank you for doing the hard work, to you and your colleagues. And I wish we weren't at this moment in history.
Absolutely. And a lot of what you both said has been echoed by the annual Feed Ontario hunger report that comes out, and the most recent report predicted a continued uptick in use of food banks in 2025. Interestingly, one of the other things the report talks about is this lack of political drive to actually make major investments in poverty reduction. And it attributed at least some of that lack of political drive to misinformation around poverty, who is in poverty, why they're in poverty. So Gregory, I wanted to come to you to hear from you about what are some of the myths around poverty and food insecurity that you think can hamper and sort of inhibit great policy creation?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And Meaghan touched upon the idea of stigma for using food banks or accessing any resources that are available. I think one of the largest myths is people have a very defined idea of what poverty is, and often when they think about what that poverty is, we're talking about the most acute and visible forms of poverty, specifically like someone who is unhoused, for example. And there's often moral attachments that are made when those associations are made by people, and that's often due to a lack of education around what poverty is, and often invisible. And for example, our public health unit publishes an annual report on food insecurity. In 2023, it was 1 in 9 households were deemed food insecure. In 2025, it was 1 in 3. And because of that, myself and a fellow councillor, Councillor Tozo, we put forward a motion declaring a food insecurity crisis here. That means that a lot of people are suffering from poverty and food insecurity, and many don't see it because it happens behind closed doors. When I was a child, my father was injured on the job, and as such, we had a year, 2 difficult years. But my family was also fortunate because they had a support network that was available of relatives and friends who would come and help out with groceries or whatever else. Many people don't have that as well, right? And so I think that we need to address that idea, that perception of poverty, and also look at policy when we're talking about stigma. Like Meaghan, I'm so glad to hear that people, that are using your services, or people in Hamilton are beyond, or seem to be beyond, that idea of stigma. But when I'm thinking about developing food policy, for example, we do have to consider, we want people to use these services when they need to use them. And how is it that we develop pilot programs, for example, that can encourage people to use food bank, use these resources as they're available? And one idea that we have is, it's called a social market. So we're doing a pilot project, and I believe I've spoken about this before, and people have mentioned that similar things have been tried, which is it will be in a space, looks like a store, and you can just kind of walk in and take what you need, and that's it. And I think it's not necessarily for primary ingredients, but more like secondary ingredients when we're talking about food preparation, because those tend to, though everything's been getting more expensive, but those tend to be more expensive. And we also want to encourage people who are perhaps higher on the socioeconomic scale to feel that it's okay to use these services, to bring them in, and then, if necessary, guide them to additional resources. So that's something that we're going to be trying in the near future. I'm very excited about that. So I think that when we're talking about these pieces, that consideration of stigma and the idea of what poverty is very important. And we need to make sure that policymakers, when they're having these discussions, understand that that's not the case, and how we can make these services as accessible as possible for everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gregory. That reminds me, there is actually a community organization in the small town that I live in that was started, that is sort of similar, I think, to that concept. It's sort of a cashless store. So it's almost like a thrift store with lots of household goods, but then also has food available in it as well. So it's a really, really interesting concept. Just to stick with you for one more minute, Gregory. So you talked about some of those myths around poverty and food insecurity. I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the recent policies that have been implemented in your area. I know in your introduction, you sort of gave us a big long list. Is there maybe one that you'd like to tell us a little bit more about, Gregory?
So I really wanted to plug the social market, so I got to do that. So that's fantastic. I think we're also investing in vertical farming. So we are going to be, we've ordered these, they're kind of like shipping containers, and they're going to produce tens of thousands of pounds of fresh produce every year. In addition to that, we have a food for fines, or fines for food program, which is, we take 1 month of revenue from parking tickets per year, and we invest that into our food networks. So we invested into food banks, into community organizations, and it's very popular and very, very successful, actually. It was so successful that in our last budget negotiations and discussions, I amended the budget to add an additional $200,000 to the program, simply to ensure, in these difficult and uncertain political and economic times, that food banks have the money that's needed to continue operating, because they are under stress. So those are some other policy pieces that we've been working on that I'm very proud of.
Yeah, that's very creative. Maybe makes people a little less grumpy when they get a parking ticket, if they know it's like for a good cause, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to Evan and Meaghan next. Just wanting to hear from you. I guess we'll start with Evan and then Meaghan second, about, from your perspective, where you feel policies are really falling short when it comes to addressing the root causes of food insecurity.
Well, I'm at risk of repeating myself, Jessica. I think Gregory's points around housing policy is probably the main driver that we've got, or the main lever we've got. Unfortunately, that's a very slow process to correct that problem. So we are in our, if the root cause of food insecurity, and for many families, or for many food insecure families, is unaffordable housing, that is a very hard one to fix in the short term. Well nigh impossible, I would argue. So we then need to rely on things like the tax code, which we've already talked about, as a way of getting funding into people at a scale that perhaps is useful. As a volunteer, I'm on the board of directors of a Canadian charity called the Maple Leaf Centre for Food Security that funds a lot of community food security work. And we're increasingly funding programs that provide direct subsidies for food. So grocery cards, like credit cards that can be used for groceries and things like that, as a way of directly and immediately impacting people's ability to purchase food. None of these things are simple. The execution of all these programs is very, very complicated and problematic in all sorts of ways, but that's one that we've worked with. Another one that we've funded, in addition to providing services to help people file their taxes more effectively, is there's an interesting moment when a person moves from an unhoused situation to a housed situation where you often see a drop in food security, which seems counterintuitive, but often unhoused people are able to access community kitchens and quote unquote soup kitchen type environments and get meals. And they're suddenly in an environment where they have to shop and cook for themselves and may not have the skills or the fungible income to do that. So we're trying to provide funding to bridge people at that moment where we observe a high level of vulnerability that seems counterintuitive. But there's 3 examples of things that we're at the Maple Leaf Center for Action on Food Security attempting to look at as ways of addressing this, while I think we work on the longer term project, which is what Gregory's been talking about, which is affordable housing. Over and out.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I like that the visual of the bridge, because I think that's come up even in some of Meaghan's discussions, right? You're trying to bridge someone from this sort of one-off usage of the food bank to hopefully not needing it as frequently. Meaghan, anything you wanted to add there in terms of where you think policies are really falling short when it comes to food insecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think housing affordability is a huge piece. We've definitely discussed that, and I think that's a significant factor. I think also income support programs are an opportunity here, because I think when Evan talks about the transitions, moving from someone who's moving into their own house for the first time, we often find many of our neighbors are in this kind of cycle where they want to be off of OW or ODSP. They're trying to get some sort of employment, some sort of gainful employment. And between that time period where they're kind of starting to get employment, it seems like their ODSP drops off very quickly. And then there's this reconfiguring where they actually have to try to survive on less money for a period of time while working, while doing childcare. Like all of the things that come with being in the workforce hit them, and their basis is taken out from underneath them. So I think that looking at the transition times for people as they're working towards better employment, better income for themselves is really a key area that I think we can dig into. I know that's an area that Community Food Centres Canada, Food Secure Canada, many of the larger national organizations are looking at all those income supports, right from all of the disability benefits through Ontario Works. Something our region has done, which I think is pretty neat in terms of supporting people who are on Ontario Works, is we're a partner in a 3-partner collaborative who are actually providing a one-time a month additional food program for everyone who's on the Ontario Works. And it's scaled based on the number of people in the household, such that we know that people who are on Ontario Works, if they're a single or a couple, actually are more financially insecure, more income insecure than a family, because families get certain other benefits due to child benefits. And so we are offering a food complement that includes fresh fruits and vegetables, and also a lot of those proteins that are really expensive to purchase once a month as an additional top up. And they actually decided to move towards food from doing a grocery voucher program because they really wanted to focus on food security. And it's very hard to know which is the best one, because I think a lot of times people liked to go and select the foods that they needed. They liked that $20 gift card, but they also do like the food components. So I think there's a lot of different mechanisms that are being played with and tried, and it's really going to have to be a collaboration of things that really start to work towards this income bracket, because everyone's situation is so different. So I think that would be my thought, is that really it's to me, it all comes down to income. It's not about the food. We have incredible food in our country, and it's really about making sure people can afford it to make their own selections.
Absolutely. And I liked how you talk about transitions, right? Because even if you're transitioning for the better, right? Transitions are hard for a whole host of non-financial reasons. And I think, what you're talking about is, as someone's going through those transitions, they have enough things weighing on their shoulders. Let's try to help smooth out the financial so they can take that one off their shoulders, right? And deal with all of the other things that come with transition. So this question I want to sort of throw to all of you. We're wondering here from a community perspective, what is the one thing you wish people knew? And here we're talking about people broadly, sort of everyday neighbors we would meet on the street. Is the one thing you wish people knew or understood better about food policy? Gregory, I'll maybe come to you first because we haven't heard from you in a few minutes.
Oh, yeah, no, thank you, Jessica. That's a great question. How complicated it is. How complicated our food network is, the production, the distribution, the education components, the different organizations working together. It's great to see so many different organizations providing such great work. But to go in as someone who develops policy, meet with the people running an organization and really learn about how it works and where they get their food from, and then the cooperation and partnerships with agricultural business or farmers, like it is remarkable how complicated it is. And then that's just one facet of it, of course. And Meaghan and Evan, you've touched on the other piece, which is that when you're in different the level of your need is going to dictate what policies are being used or what services you're accessing. And so then there's the complexity on the individual level as well, and not just the organizational or distributional level. And so it can be a significant challenge to communicate the complexities of that to people who are inquiring for whatever reason, often very well-meaning. And so I guess that's part of my job as an elected representative, to do that. But it is the more I learn, it's just really remarkable. It's really remarkable what's being done, what's being piloted, but also how complicated it is.
Absolutely. And I think to link back to our earlier question there about misinformation, right? I think hopefully if people understand how complicated it is, they hopefully have a propensity to ask questions and inquire before passing judgment, right?
Exactly.
Evan, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. Well, there's a couple of myths I would dearly love to bust. And the first one is that if we just take all the wasted food and the scrapings off our plate and got it into food banks, then hunger would go away. And again, that's I mean, I hear that sort of argument all the time, that food waste can be repurposed and solve hunger. And no, I mean, Meaghan's program is great. We want to utilize the food that's out there as best as possible. But at best, that is addressing a symptom. It's not addressing a long-term cause. So that's a myth I'd like to bust. Another myth I'd like to bust is Canada's a food exporter. Why don't we stop exporting food and feed Canadians? Well, we export canola and we export commodities like peas. We import fruits and vegetables. We're part of a global trading network, and the idea of just producing everything for Canadians is really simplistically a very simplistic understanding of the food system. So there's another myth I'd very much like to bust. And then the final myth I'd very much like to bust is that poverty is in somehow lazy people are poor people and that kind of stuff. No, people who come to Canada, racialized people, Indigenous communities face massive systemic barriers to achieving a dignified life. And we have a responsibility, I think, to ourselves and to our fellow citizens to try to dismantle those barriers. And it's, and so that's another myth that I would very much like to bust. And if we could make progress on those three myths, I'd be very grateful. So thank you for letting me get on my soapbox. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. As a pig farmer, Evan, I particularly liked the second one because, as you probably know, we export a lot of pigs as well as pork from Canada, right? And again, just saying we should keep it all here glosses over some of that complexity that Gregory was talking about, things such as processing capacity, right? So you start to realize just how complicated those things can be. Meaghan, anything you'd like to add?
Oh, that's hard to follow up with. Okay, so I had a few thoughts. Don't have that many myths to bust, but I think, Evan, you alluded to this in maybe your intro, which was talking about the price of food. And I think right now, when we have so many people who are struggling to feed their families, it's very easy to get tied up on that. It's all about the price of food, it's because of the cost of food. And I think we have something in our industry right now in terms of best before dates that is driving a lot of people to not utilize the food that they do have access to as efficiently. So I think that one of the things I would really like to see changed is this idea of the best before dates, because we know expiry dates are important. Best before dates are a misleading thing that often affects our most marginalized communities who are not able to go out and just replace the food that they have. And instead of, being able to access the food that they have in their pantries, they're seeing this best before date that tells them the food they're eating is bad, when that is actually not the case. And we see so much food get wasted because of this number on a can or number on a package, when that food could actually be utilized. So I think in terms of the general consumer, we know that 40% of food gets wasted at the households. It is an important thing for our environment and for our ag industry, that all of those resources, everything that goes into producing that food doesn't get thrown out simply because of a date on a package, when that date is not actually to determine the full nutritional quality. So I think it may be a policy component. To me, it's more of an industry component that we need to kind of get behind and really look at that piece. So yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Meaghan. That wasn't something we talked about earlier, so thanks for bringing that forward. I think that's a fabulous idea. I'm going to shift to some question and answer time because we've received some great questions. So I'll be looking over a little bit here at some of the live questions that have come in, but I'll get us started with one. So the first question, so far we've talked mostly about policy, government, social programs, but the question is around more private sector. So how can we rely more on the private sector and individuals to help address food insecurity as opposed to just relying on government? What critical gaps can the private sector innovate in to encourage and strengthen local food systems? So Gregory give me a little wave. So we'll start with Gregory, and then we can certainly hear multiple voices on this question.
Well, I'm speaking, I'm sure a more thorough answer to systemic, filling in systemic gaps will be provided, but I just with regards to private organizations stepping in when food banks are in need, for example. There's partnerships, grocery store partnerships with food banks, and that's one way that private organizations are really helping. But the other one is just being generous and charitable. And after the declaration of the food insecurity in Kingston, I had a number of business owners who reached out to me asking how they could help. And my answer is, in the immediate term, I will give you the contact information for the directors of these organizations, and almost $1 million was donated within a couple of weeks. That's people often, a lot of people care, and it's just trying to help them to find the way that they can help, and within their means, of course. And so I think that that's one answer to that. And I think that we need to have these partnerships, and we need to make sure that everybody is communicating with each other, especially in moments of urgency and need. But yeah, that would be my answer for that.
Perfect. Meaghan, I imagine you work with private entities, private businesses in your work. So do you want to shed some light on this from your perspective?
We do, yeah. We're very grateful to the private sector, corporates, businesses, and individuals, because we receive a lot of our support through donations and food and funds. So that's really what keeps our core work going, is community support, and we're very grateful for that. I think what I would suggest in terms of how they can get involved in the deeper root systemic challenges that we're facing is to look at wages. We know right now in Halton, to be a living wage employer, you're starting at paying about $26 an hour for your staff, less if you're providing benefits and those sorts of things. So I think some internal look at your own companies, your own ways there to make sure that you're not inadvertently causing a situation where your staff are needing to seek food supports, even though you're well intentioned potentially. I think also that continued commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's incredibly important. We know that people who are marginalized, Black and Indigenous communities are at much higher percentage of needing food support, of experiencing food insecurity. And we want to make sure we are breaking those barriers wherever possible. So I think that another internal look there. And lastly, I would say looking at where you're directing dollars. We're very careful with where we select our suppliers and where we get our support from, because we're using donor dollars in our community. And we know that to create a strong local food system, we need dollars coming from the local economy back into the food system. So I think if you have purchasing power in terms of food, then you want to look at how you can best utilize that purchasing power with local agriculture and local food producers.
I think that's great, Meaghan. I liked how you sort of encouraged that, take a hard look at your own company first, right? It's nice if a local business donates money to the food bank, but what you'd rather do first is make sure that they're appropriately taking care of their own staff so that their own staff are not showing up and knocking on the doors of your food bank, right? Evan, anything you'd like to add?
No, I've got nothing to add. Those were great answers, and just 2 thumbs up for me.
Perfect. Okay, so another audience question here. How do you see the current trade environment impacting food insecurity in Canada, and what could Canada maybe do in response? Maybe a big question, but Evan, do you have anything you'd like to add to that one?
Sure. I mean, wow. I mean, holy moly. I've already done 12 interviews today on this very topic for CBC. So feeling a little hoarse on this issue. I mean, the 2 big impacts are going to be lower farm incomes and higher food price inflation, higher food prices. I mean, it feels like a very complicated issue. Who's tariffing what and when and how, and the whipsaw of Trump's yes, no, maybe so kind of things. China's tariffs, which are affecting you, Jessica, in terms of a pork producer. Your ability to export pork into China is much harder now than it was 2 months ago. So I really feel badly for Canadian producers who are facing very, very stiff headwinds. And folks, I mean, we have to remember that over the winter in Canada, farmers make decisions, crop farmers make decisions about what seeds to buy and how much fertilizer to lay in. And that investment that they have to make decisions around in January, February kind of time will only bear fruit for them in terms of their family's income in September, October, November, when the harvest is in. So, I'm finding it hard to plan what to do next week, given the volatility, let alone a producer who's having to make decisions, many, many months out. So big impacts there. And the other aspect, of course, is all of this will likely produce, at least in the medium term, food price inflation. Maybe if the Canadian dollar craters, our imports will benefit because it'll be cheap to export into Canada. But overall, this is going to drive another wave of food price inflation, which our consumers cannot bear. So I'm really worried, and I don't want to be a downer on this conversation, because in many regards I am optimistic. But this current trade environment, let's put it this way: ever since 1990, with the signing of the first free trade agreement, we have been told that policy and politics would support the integration, at least at the North American and at the global level, of a food system. And that's brought food prices down. It's created labor problems and environmental problems. But it's something that we've done for 40 years. And now we're trying to dismantle that in 6 weeks. And it's going to cause costs to go up, and it's going to cause farm incomes to go down. And I wish I had another way of looking at it.
Absolutely. A little bleak, but very much appreciate your very comprehensive answer there, Evan. I'm going to throw one more question at us that hopefully sends us a little bit more up on a positive here to end off. So this question came from one of our audience members today. What can the average Canadian do to advocate for better policy around food insecurity? So if people listening today want to actually take action because you've inspired them about the importance of this, what can they actually do to help make a difference? Gregory or Meaghan? Want to dive into this one?
Yeah, I think that there's lots of different things that the average person can do. They can reach out to their elected representatives and advocate on an individual level there. And I think it's really important that when we talk about food insecurity, we're talking about income, right? That connection is made if you're going to be doing advocacy to either a member of parliament, member of provincial parliament, or a municipal representative. The other thing is you can volunteer. You can volunteer at food banks. You can volunteer at any of like Martha's Tables, one of the organizations they have that serve warm meals. I think that these are really important things that any individual can do to help on a very local level. If you know of any community organizations that advocate for food policy, we have several here that were very big in pushing, for example, for the school meal program. Get involved, ask around, and it's every person in all their good efforts count, and they matter, and they make a difference. So do what you can, and it will be appreciated.
Wonderful. Meaghan, anything you want to add a little further west down the 401?
I think Gregory, you covered it very well. I think everyone has a role to play. I think one of the biggest things that all Canadians can do right now is to vote on April 28th. Whatever party you want to vote for, think about how they deal with food insecurity, and make that a priority for yourself. I think that would be a huge boost to our entire sector and our country.
Thank you so much, Meaghan. So we're approaching the end of our hour here. This has been very engaging and informative, and I'd really like to thank our three panelists, Councillor Gregory Ridge, Meaghan Richardson, and Evan Fraser, for taking the time to speak with us today. As we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just share with us. You've shared with us some really neat projects each of you have been working on. So if people wanted to kind of follow along with what you're doing in this space, where would you send them? So we'll go Evan, Gregory, Meaghan.
Well, we're in a federal election right now, and the Food Secure Canada is organizing what we call Eat, Think, Vote events across the country. I don't know if they're not in every jurisdiction and every constituency, but lots of constituencies have Eat, Think, Vote events, which are all candidate meetings where the candidates from all political parties are asked a series of questions around food policy, poverty, agricultural policy, sustainability, a wide range of questions. So it's not too late to organize an Eat, Think, Vote event. It's not too late to go to Eat, Think, Vote events. And certainly even if your constituency does not have an Eat, Think, Vote event, or you don't have one locally, it's not too late to ask your candidates what they are going to do to address food insecurity in Canada. And this is a good window for raising that question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Evan. Gregory, over to you.
I think if people want to see what we're doing at the City of Kingston on a food policy level, please check out our website, cityofkingston.ca. We have a get involved portal where it shows you all the different work that's being done on different projects, including our food projects, our food policy development. So I would really encourage people to check that out. And I think that there's a lot of really positive food policy development that's coming from the city. We're going to be having a big vote on our food integrated network policy implementation this May. And so there's lots of good stuff coming. And if people want to check that out, cityofkingston.ca, check out our good work. Thank you.
Perfect. We'll be curious to see the social market as that comes to pass too, Gregory. Meaghan, where can we hear more about your great work?
Yeah, so like Gregory, all of our stuff is on our website, foodforlife.ca. We also have all of our social channels, so you can follow us there. So we have lots of opportunities to get involved in every capacity, from volunteering, corporate team experiences, donations, all of that. And also, if you know someone looking for food support in Hamilton or Halton, they can access all of our food programs very easily there, or call. We have a social worker on staff that helps navigate all of the programs for people. So we welcome that. And then Evan did a great segue for us, because we are a good food organization under oh my gosh, Community Food Banks Canada. Nope.
Community Food Centers Canada,
Community Food
CFCC.
Centers Canada. I always mess that up, Evan. Thank you. We are doing an Eat, Think, Vote event alongside them on April 23rd. So if you'd like to come out to that, we would love to have you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meaghan, for that and for all the important work that you do. So with that, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today for our Impact Live event. Next week, a recording and summary of this session will be shared, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. We will also share with you where you can find out more about the Center for Building Sustainable Value and the Future of Agri-Food series. As you exit the webinar today, you'll be presented with a short survey. We would really appreciate it if you could fill that out. And finally, be sure to save the date for Ivey's next Impact Live event. So this one is called Under the Scope, Canada's Healthcare Workforce Crisis. So it will be taking place on May the 13th. It will be moderated by Ivey professor Lauren Cipriano. This event will bring a panel of the country's leading healthcare voices together to examine the critical workforce shortage in healthcare and strategies to repair and rebuild the system. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Thanks again to everyone, especially our 3 guests, Evan, Gregory, and Meaghan, for taking the time to spend with us today, and take care.